A couple of Thursdays ago, I was at a dinner at the MCG for the Australia-India Institute. I arrived a little bit late. Fortunately, so did the young student who was sitting next to me. We chatted a bit about his postgraduate studies. Not much. He was an economic geographer, and so there wasn't very much that I could contribute to a conversation about that. Then it emerged why we were both late. We had both first gone to our respective cricket clubs, where we were long-serving committee members, to set up training and have a net. Economic geography may have a lot going for it, but it does not bring people together so successfully as talking about sport. Although not sport generally, but one's own sport. By evening's end, we both knew everything about where the other played, what were the issues, who were the characters, where we'd started, why we loved it. I'm a journalist, but for far longer than that have I been a community sports participant. At the age of 9, I joined the St James Presbyterian Under-12 Bs. There were no Cs. I've hardly risen above this level in the ensuing 5 decades. I'm still a C-grade cricketer. All that's changed in that time is that I've gone from only playing to also running. I've been a committee member, as Mark was saying, at the Yarras for near about 20 years. Periodically, my personal life has impinged. A girl once had me choose between being her boyfriend and being Yarras chairman of selectors, and I opted for the former, albeit narrowly and not in the end availingly. But in general, I've contoured my life to suit sport as much as the other way around. I was married in a mid-season break. I became a father in a mid-season break. In neither instance did I miss a training, let alone a game. A lot of my life has been around sport. My head in high performance, but my heart in low performance. And over the years, I've had innumerable conversations like the one that I had those few Thursdays ago, and I've learned that I'm not all that unusual, nor really is my club. My friend of that evening described how one of his players had driven from Canberra for a recent game. I was able to tell him about the player that we had who'd relocated to Sydney and had continued to fly down at weekends until he could find a new job in Melbourne. We're great patriots, we club members. We know that our club is but one of many, but we like to think of it as special, if not unique. Now, I can't say that I speak with any particular expertise. I've got no certificate, I've got no training, I've got no quantitative research behind me. I don't even have PowerPoint. What I do have, though, is a powerful cumulative sense that we should be thinking much more about what we have in common and how distinctive a feature the sporting club is in this country. In 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote after visiting America, "A great democratic revolution is taking place in our midst." One of the key indicators, he felt, was not inspirational leadership or stirring civic rhetoric, but voluntary assembly. As he said, Americans of all ages, all conditions and all dispositions constantly form associations. In the United States, associations are established to promote public order, commerce, industry, morality and religion. For there is no end which the human will, seconded by the collective exertions of individuals, despairs of attaining. De Tocqueville's Democracy in America, a pioneering work of what would now be called sociology, was one of the first to illuminate how small groups serve as conduits to organised social power, directing individual action towards productive ends. Australian civic assembly, as that of a colony rather than an independent nation, took a different, if related, form. Within 2 years of the settlement of Melbourne, citizens had founded the Melbourne Cricket Club, dedicated by one of its founders to men of all classes, the plebeian mingling with the peer in respectful feeling and good fellowship, a character which it's arguable it has maintained, assuming, of course, you can wait 20 years to find out. Melbourne's first significant rival was the Brighton Cricket Club, still prospering, 170 years young. Tasmania's oldest surviving cricket clubs date from around about the same time. South Australia's oldest surviving cricket clubs from about a century and a half ago. They are older, therefore, than a majority of Australia's legislatures, an overwhelming number of our municipalities, and all but a tiny handful of our commercial enterprises. Australia's oldest racing club, Aspley, near Edenhope, predates the Melbourne Cup. Australia's oldest swimming club, Balmain Amateur in Sydney, is only 10 years younger than England's oldest. Australia's oldest soccer club, Balgownie Rangers in Wollongong, is older than Arsenal and Celtic. Why did sport feature so prominently in the formation of civic culture in Australia? Well, by the middle of the 19th century, we were among the most urbanised continents in the world. 4 in 10 of us in the 6 major ports, half the population in towns or villages. There was also our distance from Europe, which prolonged the dearth of women. Males who paid their own passages to the colonies outnumbered women 2 to 1. They were disproportionately young, in conditions of scarce labour, which enabled them to secure short working hours and greater leisure. They were also largely from Britain, which had an incipient games tradition. Plus, we succeeded. In the 1870s, colonial scullers burned up the rivers of Britain. From the 1880s, we were beating England at cricket. The Olympics arrived at the dawn of the nation. Frederick Lane won the first individual male swimming golds at the Games of 1900, Fanny Durack the first female swimming golds in 1912. As Geoffrey Blainey commented in his Boyer Lectures, This Land is All Horizons, a country valorises that at which it succeeds. Had our athletes in this formative period been no good, it's unlikely our sporting culture would today cast such a long shadow. For numberless millions of Australians since, a sports club has been their original and most tangible experience of day-to-day democracy and their deepest investment in local amenity. 4 key figures in Federation, George Reid, Edmund Barton, Charles Kingston and Thomas Playford, were club delegates to cricket associations where they rose to vice-presidential rank. While a 22-year-old assistant accountant in the Colonial Treasury, for example, George Reid was elected delegate to the New South Wales Cricket Association by the Warwick Cricket Club, the same club, incidentally, as Dave Gregory, Australia's first captain. After 9 years, Reid became Association Treasurer and served as Association President while he was the Premier of New South Wales, resigning only in the year that he became Prime Minister. Reid was not himself a noted player, although he might have been a handy sight screen, being roughly as wide as he was tall, and he certainly sledged like an Australian cricketer. Once, while addressing an audience from a hotel balcony in Newcastle, he nonchalantly propped his belly on the balustrade. "What'll you name it, George?" called a heckler. Reid replied, "If it's all piss and wind as I expect, I'll name it after you, young fella." Consult the NSWCA annual reports in Reid's time and you'll find 3 future premiers, James McGowan, Joseph Carruthers and John Story, acting as delegates for the Redfern, University and Balmain clubs respectively. Carruthers and Story, interestingly, were born rivals. Carruthers was a hotshot lawyer and a dyed-in-the-wool conservative. Story was a state school-educated boilermaker and a self-described evolutionary socialist. What made them unlikely lifelong friends was representing the same parliamentary 11. As Carruthers wrote in his memoirs, "There were other men of different shades of political belief in the cricket team, and I can say of them as I say of Story and myself that the bitterness of party strife disappeared during contact with one another in the cricket field." Historian John Hirst has called Australia's a democracy of manners. Australia, he observes, is short on inspirational rhetoric about democracy, constitutionally silent on citizenship. What we have instead, says Hirst, is a way that Australians blot out differences when people meet face to face and talk to each other as if they are equals. And in no environment has this tended to happen more spontaneously than when individuals band together in pursuit of a sporting goal. Club sport remains, I would argue, the most inclusive, evolved and constructive means by which Australians express their instinct to associate. Now, it's a sorry reflection on the times that so few, outside an immediate circle, seem to grasp that. As if the thrall of the television remote and the atomisation of the working week were not enough, community sport has suffered gravely from the climate of financial stringency and sterile user-pays philosophies. That local governments complain of having to subsidise sporting clubs strikes me as altogether bizarre. Certainly it is oblivious to the way that sporting clubs subsidise local governments by mobilising free labour and local expertise, contributing to social cohesion and civic texture, enhancing the aesthetic appeal of our suburbs and curating the urban environment. In fact, the minuscule funding support that local sport receives has colossal multiplier effects. In the last 10 years, for example, I've watched my club, the Yarras, being completely revolutionised by South Asians. They compose 30% of our playing stocks. I know many other clubs where they are now in the majority. It hasn't happened overnight. It hasn't happened without some setbacks, and it certainly hasn't happened without some planning. There have been a succession of waves of South Asian players, but we're now up to, I think, the third wave, and a third of our 11s are now, three of our 6 11s are now led by Indians, our coach and several of our committee. They've been turned gradually from cricketers into community members. And many of them have said to me over time that Australian sport is to them a kind of revelation in its accessibility and its resourcefulness. They could never have played so regularly and so happily in India. I'd like actually to personalise this and tell you a tale or two about some club members that I have at the Yarras. Nashad, his nickname is the Dhaka Express. He's 30. He arrived at the club about 8 years ago. He's an IT guy with very little. He arrived with very little English, planning to stay a couple of years, then return to an arranged marriage in Bangladesh. He bowled medium-pace filth and smeared everything to mid-wicket, and he still does. But through the Yarras, everything else of his life has changed. His English became garrulous and noisy. He naturalised, he met a girl at a club function who he married, and they have a daughter, and he became, without doubt, the worst captain that I have ever seen. Full of crazy intuitions and ridiculous brainstorms, always reversing his order, bowling part-timers, changing the field after every ball, but somehow getting everyone on board with his enthusiasm and good humour. His vice-captain last summer was Happy, whose nickname is entirely ironic. He's always complaining about something. He's 73. For many years, Happy played his own way and was always gone 5 minutes after stumps. Then, about 6 years ago, Happy was suddenly everywhere. He was at every training, every club function. He'd come down to other games. It slowly emerged. His wife had died. Once it was learned, it was never mentioned again. But the club was there when he needed it. And last summer, he was our club man of the year. He's a tough little opener, gets hit a lot, scores mainly in long singles. Nobody turns down a second run with such withering scorn as Happy. But there he is with the Dhaka Express, 43 years and continents of experience between them, trying very hard to cooperate, and somehow both of them being the better for it. I might mention one other teammate of both, Basher, who joined us about 10 years ago. Now, Basher's in his early 60s. He played a lot of very good sport, country football, rep cricket, and when he joined us, he was a very, very big unit who came in off 5 steps and landed the ball, perfect length, vertical seam, hit the ball far into the stratosphere, took improbable catches at slip, and had a very dry sense of humour. About 5 years ago, he said to me on the way home from training, "I'm in a bit of trouble, mate." He had cancer of the tongue, very terrible and potentially lethal cancer that took him out for about 3 years, in which he had to have his jaw completely reconstructed. He's now about half the size. He lives on food that his wife pulps for him, but there was hardly a dry eye in the house when he accepted the 5th bowling averages a couple of seasons ago, stood up and said, "This is what kept me going." One of my favourite moments last season was when Express, Happy and Basher were playing in the 6ths and had Macca, a good offie down from the higher grades. Macca is a hard man, vehemently competitive, a very big sledger. He came on, he bowled his first over, a maiden, then came back for his second, and Express threw the ball to someone else. Macca stood there at the bowler's end, speechless, his face turning puce with fury. And as the field changed over, Basher walked past and said out the corner of his mouth, "Ah, fuck off, Macca." So why am I telling you this? Partly because in my discussions with Mark, he asked me to consider the notion of return on investment. It's a lovely idea, but it depends on being able to measure 2 things. One is investment and the other is return. I can't tell you what the Dakar Express, Happy and Basher have invested in the Yarras. All I can confidently assert is that they would all say that the return has been disproportionately greater. That might not be an altogether comfortable answer in this quantifying age, but then so much about this age is wrong, and I'm too old and too grumpy to stand here and collude in the pretence that it's right. The sterile rhetoric of the market, the barren platitudes of the policy elite, they're what underlie the fury of modern populist politics, and we all know where that's dragged us. I guess I also want to articulate this, because as far as I'm concerned, community sport tends to a preoccupation with the latter at the expense of the former. And if the Yarras was only about sport, I'd long since have lost interest. I'm not good enough, I'm not ambitious enough, and I'm not mad enough to have stuck playing cricket this long for cricket's sake alone, much as I love it. And I think I speak for a pretty sizable proportion of the population. Sport is why we come, but it's not why we stay. I could say it's about the people, but that would be banal. There's also the wonder that we all feel that our lives, otherwise so different, otherwise so demanding, so stretched, dispersed and time-poor, can have intersected so meaningfully and enjoyably in this special way with such a wealth of ready-made common interest in circumstances of our own design with outcomes so much greater than the sum of the parts. For our clubs are distinguished to this day by actually working. Running a local cricket club, I've heard it said, is a little bit like running a cemetery. There are lots of people underneath you, but none of them are listening. But in our daily lives, I think we're regularly beset by institutions that leave us feeling powerless, voiceless, helpless. Government institutions, commercial institutions, financial, religious and media institutions. It's easy to think, what does it matter what I do? What influence can I possibly have? At the little sporting institutions we make for ourselves, we aren't powerless. We can and do make a difference. We can put a shoulder to the wheel and feel the thing move. It's a compulsion, it's a habit, it's a hankering for home, it's a quest for the solace of the simple and the familiar. But I leave practice or a game at the Yarras feeling divested of concern about anything else, at least momentarily. Perhaps that's why we've gone on playing sport in times of extremity, in war, amid natural disaster and other tragic events. To play a game so complex, so ceremonial, so protracted, so full of waiting, so filled with luck, as I said, it's an act of optimism, it's an act of hope, of desire for connection, of instinct to order, rather than simply a recreation undertaken for the pleasure of stretching one's limbs. And while, of course, we'd like our clubs to be successful, I fancy that we may not want them to be so successful that they become big, rich, complicated, impersonal. That might be a little bit too much like everyday life, from which, when we play sport, we're usually seeking some distance. There's an interesting contrast, I think, between those groups we form ourselves for our own enjoyment and beneficiation and those formed for us for maximum economic efficiency. The modern corporate world has developed to a fine art the act of building empires of strangers. For our own parts, we seem to prefer environments where it remains possible to know everyone's name, where we're connected by the intangibles of friendship and mutual reciprocity rather than by the formality of titles, ranks, reporting lines and organisational matrices, where we're drawn to share a common physical space imbued with deep meanings rather than lightly joined by the gossamer of social media. The sports club is a bastion of human scale and personal contact in a world growingly indifferent to both. And when push comes to shove, there's a surprising unity, a preparedness to put others first, a recognition that if we don't get it done, then it won't get done. It's those moments that over the years have really lifted me rather than the playing achievements. That way that people have of revealing their best, even as one can be bracing for their worst. Like I said, I'm not a politician or a technocrat or an expert. I don't have any quantitative data I can cite, no focus groups. All I can tell you is how it feels and the enrichment that I gain and the value inherent in being able to sit down next to a stranger, learn only one thing about them, and immediately to know that we have lots in common, lots to talk about.